very interesting to read the NSS. It is at times, I think, a strange and contradictory document. It is what all strategies are, which is the least common denominator of an interagency review process, and it reflects the views of, frankly, competing factions within the Trump administration.
My name is Yun Sun. I'm the Senior Fellow and Director of China Program at the Stimson Center in Washington. I'm pleased to introduce our guests for today's interview. We have Sheena Greitens, who is an Associate Professor at the University of Texas at Austin, where she directs the Asia Policy Program and serves as Editor-in-Chief of the Texas National Security Review. She is also a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a visiting faculty at the China Land Power Studies Center of the U.S. Army War College Strategy Studies Institute. For our guests, we also have Mr. Ryan Fedasiuk, who is a fellow with the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on U.S. China relations, technology, and national power. He is an adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown University. Before joining AEI, Mr. Fedasiuk was the director of the U.S. AI policy at the Future Society. He was also a U.S. China bilateral affairs advisor and technology advisor at the State Department's Office of China Coordination, senior research analyst at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology, and aerospace security researcher at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you both for joining me. So for today's discussion, we're primarily focused on the most recently launched national security strategy by the second Trump administration. As everyone knows, this document has produced a number of heated discussions about what U.S. strategic priorities should be, what is our grand strategy about the Indo-Pacific region, as well as the Monroe Doctrine, or some would call Monroe Doctrine today. So with Sheena and also with Ryan, today I have prepared a few questions related to how this NSS will reflect on U.S.-China relations. To begin with, I would like to pose a question. What is your overall impression of the national security strategy? Because many people have seen it as a major deviation from the previous U.S. grand strategy of the past decades. And in the most recent 8 years, it was focused on great power competition. So do you see this as a deviation, which will eventually be corrected at some point? Or this is more permanent adjustment of U.S. approach to the world? Perhaps with this question, we could go to Sheena first.
Yeah, first, thanks so much for having us and for the great lineup of questions and discussion today. I think that every administration's U.S. national security strategy signals a sort of a particular moment in America's evolving role in the world. And so I think that with respect to your question, certainly, yeah, there are parts of this national security strategy, and we can get to this, that I think do change how Americans or how the administration is defining for the United States what is national security and what are the ends and the tools that the administration is using to achieve security. So yeah, I do think there are some pretty major shifts in this national security strategy. What I think some of those are likely to persist over time and beyond this administration, but some of them are probably likely to change a little bit with a future administration. Right? That's speculative, but that's typically what's happened with every administration. Even the first and second term of a president, often the national security strategies are distinctly different in some key ways. If you look at this national security strategy compared to the first Trump administration's national security strategy, there are ways in which they're quite different. But that was also true of President Obama, of the first and second George W. Bush administration. So this is just some evolution in the thinking to address the changing international environment is, I think, natural. Josh Rovner has a great book out where he talks about grand strategy as a theory of security. And so maybe something we can get into is what kind of security does this national security strategy actually look for and prioritize? And how does it try to actually then achieve security? And I think there's a much bigger role for economics in this national security strategy, including in the China piece of the strategy. But maybe I'll stop there and let Ryan jump in and offer his initial thoughts about the strategy and how big of a break it is. And then we can come back to sort of what's in the strategy itself, particularly for Asia and China.
Absolutely. Ryan, what do you think? Is this a tremendous change? I think a lot of people see it is. And what does it mean? What's your impression?
Sure. Thanks very much. First of all, thanks to both of you. What an amazing conversation, and thanks to the National Committee for hosting us. My read is that this is actually a pretty significant departure, but it's not one that's totally unexpected. It seems to me that the realists, so to speak, are winning a 30-year struggle to seize the reins of Republican foreign policy. They're shaping American conduct in ways that are both difficult to reverse and uncomfortable for many, I think, in Washington to accept. But this is an extension of a debate that has existed within the United States really since the unipolar moment about whether this country should make necessary investments to remain the dominant global power, whether to offload the cost of global governance to allies and partners, or whether to accept the limits of American power and settle for less. The document begins by wholesale rejecting 30 years of bipartisan consensus, calling out American foreign policy elites who, it says, badly miscalculated America's willingness to shoulder forever global burdens. And from that starting point to articulating the Donroe Doctrine, it's clear to me, I think, that the strategy articulates what is really a new approach to foreign policy of Trumpism, which I would say is about picking winnable fights. It does this through concrete deals or hit and run interventions that are pursued for some immediate compounding advantage and by squeezing orthogonal interests for leverage at opportune moments. And it is in many ways not so dissimilar from the realism that has characterized generations of American foreign policy before it, but it differs, I think, in two important ways. The first is so blasé, it hardly bears repeating. It's that Trumpism doesn't pretend to be diplomatic or invested in the well-being of others. It is an America first ideology. But the second element has been, I think, a little bit harder to grasp. I think opponents of Trumpism have accused it of lacking any kind of strategy because it hasn't really articulated a desired end state. It does not explicitly, nowhere in the national security strategy does it explicitly say that the U.S. is locked in a strategic competition with a rival. It mentions strategic competition at various points, but it does not assert that as a goal of the United States because it isn't. I think that Trumpism really is what the administration says it is. It's pursuing for immediate advantage anything that makes America safer, stronger, and more prosperous. And it remains to be seen what strategic ends the United States will use its safety, strength, or prosperity to achieve. And certainly there are people within the administration on Capitol Hill that are seeking to guide the direction of American foreign policy after it compounds those interests.
Really well said, Ryan. I really like your articulation about this is Trump's logic behind the national security strategy and how they're almost like redefining what the strategic landscape or the lens that U.S. National interests should be viewed, and that brings the question of China, and that's primarily what we're trying to deliberate here today, because the past two administration has pretty much defined great power competition as the central theme of U.S. national security, right? And now, like you pointed out, that this suddenly strategic competition is not in there anymore. So what does that mean? How has the China strategy changed as reflected in the national security strategy? We're pursuing different goals, we're adopting different approaches. And what is our priority here? Maybe I could go to Ryan since this natural follow-up to the comments that you just made, and then we'll turn to Sheena for her thoughts. Thank you.
Sure thing. I'll try to keep it a little shorter on this front, but it's very interesting to read the NSS. It is at times, I think, a strange and contradictory document. It is what all strategies are, which is the least common denominator of an interagency review process, and it reflects the views of, frankly, competing factions within the Trump administration. I think if you look at who is driving the foreign policy agenda in the United States today, it's best described as people who subscribe to one of three worldviews. There are those who I would describe as economic nationalists. They want to reindustrialize the United States, keep tariffs high on every country, not just China, rebuild a manufacturing base because they feel that the global trading system is no longer fit for purpose. Then you've got traditional hawks who really do buy into American primacy and military strength, at the very least within the Western Hemisphere, although there are certain factions of the administration who do see an interest in trying to retain American primacy in other theaters and are working to achieve those goals. And that comes through in parts of the strategy as well. And then finally, you've got not just people who are transactional, but people who are, I think, subscribing to the notions of realism and restraint that are advocated by one wing of the Republican Party. And this has been a domestic political debate in the United States, as I said, for almost 30 years now. But that is certainly the dominant framing of the NSS overall. When it comes to China, the place we seem to have landed really is in this third camp. The strategy is super clear in what the United States wants from China. It wants, quote unquote, a mutually beneficial economic relationship with Beijing. That is very different from the strategy pursued by the first Trump administration. It's very different from the strategy pursued by the Biden administration. And it lays out clearly that the United States will pick winnable fights with China in theaters where it believes it can win and produce some economic advantage for the United States. But overall, it wants a mutually beneficial relationship for both countries.
Absolutely. So Sheena, what's your thought on this question? I know that you observe the China strategy very closely. What do you think are the primary changes and the implication of it?
Yeah, I think the biggest shift is one that we've mentioned so far, but I think just bears stating really plainly, which is the shift away from strategic competition as the framework for U.S. China relations and how China fits in the administration's vision of American national security, right? This shift from strategic competition as the paradigm to this view that really is about American economic security and economic advantage in the U.S. China relationship. And so, yeah, I think this is actually a place where the strategy lays out more clearly than maybe some other places or overall what the end state it drives at should look like. And that is, as Ryan said, a mutually beneficial economic relationship with the PRC. Now, so that's a very different goal than anything that previously we would have seen under the strategic competition framework. Not that economic prosperity wasn't always part of strategic competition. It's been an intrinsic part of it, but it really almost reduces U.S. goals on China down to the economic dimensions of the relationship, and thereby sort of drops out some of the military or security issues that have often been at the forefront of U.S. China tensions for the last couple decades. And so what I think is really interesting about that, I think Ryan is right to highlight some of the internal contradictions here, because even though the document is clear about the end state, it isn't always clear about then what are the tools, right? So if strategy is a matching of means to ends, right? We've seen a lot of emphasis on certain economic tools in this pursuit of an economic relationship with China. But if you take tariffs, for example, which have been front and center in the Trump administration's economic pursuit of economic security, pursuit of economics as a tool of national security, and just front and center in American global and foreign policy, if you look at the U.S. China relationship, right, the administration has said contradictory things. Does it want the tariffs to be a tool of reindustrializing? Or does it want the tariffs to be used to rebalance the U.S.-China trade relationship? Those are actually different outcomes or different ends that tariffs could be used to accomplish. But knowing the answer to that question is actually very important for knowing what US negotiators should and shouldn't have as a bottom line in a conversation with a Chinese negotiating team. And it shapes how China will approach negotiations with the United States. If you want to reindustrialize the United States, there's also a very different role for allies and partners in a global tariff strategy. And so, how all of these pieces fit together, even if you're focused on economic security, even if you're focused on a mutually beneficial economic relationship with China, still, the minute you sort of dig down a bit deeper in the strategy, there are lots of potential tensions and questions that I think, we're going to have to watch play out and see where the administration and the interagency lands over time. Because I do think there are different camps, and ultimately the president's voice seems decisive. And so, how the administration reconciles these competing interests and policy tools sort of under the goals that the strategy outlines is, I think, TBD.
Absolutely. I think there's a widespread question that, well, a mutually beneficial economic relationship with China, is that a means or is that an end? And it doesn't sound like it's the end, but if it's a means, what is the end, right? I think the previous administrations also had the same question that about if strategic competition is the framing of our China strategy, what is the end that we're trying to achieve? And I think for this administration, the answer might be MAGA, Make America Great Again. Well, how is that evaluated? And especially in these other domains except economy. And that brings me to the next question, which is, do you think that this national security strategy really changed the fundamentals in our China policy? Because if you talk to thinkers, talk to members of the Congress, I think the strategic mindset is still very competitive. It's still competition oriented. And if you look at for example, the most recent NDAA, China's threats is still a very prominent, highlighted domain of threats in that document, and we still allocate significant resources to the China's threats. So has the document or this new vision of the second Trump administration really changed the fundamentals of our China policy? I wonder what is your thought? Maybe Ryan, any thought out there?
It's a good question. It's a tension I feel every day in Washington. I think both of you do too. And I'm interested to see how it plays out. The best way I can put it is that, I think Congress embodies this bipartisan China consensus that has transcended multiple presidential administrations and which encompasses much of President Trump's current approach to China. But it certainly, I think, is more difficult for many members of Congress to accept the direction that the administration has been headed in with its China policy. It does articulate a specific goal. It's very clear in the national security strategy that the United States, quote, our ultimate objective is to lay the foundation for long-term economic vitality, end quote. The goal is specified throughout the document is to grow the U.S. economy by a third over the next decade, including through this mutually beneficial relationship with Beijing. That is a fast departure from where Congress has been on China. This is a very specific read, I think, of what the U.S. national interest ought to be within Asia. And it is different from how the United States has conceived of its own power throughout the Indo-Pacific. And I'll be interested to see how things shake up leading up to and after the midterms. Frankly, I agree with your assessment that the NDAA and much congressional activity is different from what is laid out in the strategy. The NDAA sets, I think, the floor of U.S. action. It commits the United States to funding certain initiatives focused on Pacific deterrence. It commits the United States by law to restricting certain economic and technological transactions with the PRC. The NSS and the executive's purview, however, is to set the direction of U.S. policy on top of this floor. And so it's not clear to me where exactly things will shake out. The one thing I tell people when U.S. corporates and international businesses ask about what they should expect of U.S. China relations and how aggressive or how dovish is U.S. policy going to be. I think that history suggests congressional action on China will prove more durable than just this NSS or even a single presidential administration. There have been real costs that are borne by Americans associated with China's technological rise. The downstream effects of the China shock that has engulfed a growing number of industries are not a narrative fiction that are set by any individual elite. They are an indelible and deeply felt concern for many Americans and their representatives in Congress. And even a president as powerful as Trump is not capable of entirely erasing them through productive diplomacy, regardless of the wisdom of that foreign policy direction.
Absolutely. And Sheena, I know that you are watching this very closely because you also observe the federal government state level interaction with China. Do you see that that the document alone really changes the fundamentals in our China policy from different aspects?
Well, I think it changes a big part. Constitutionally, right? The US Constitution gives significant foreign policy making power to the executive branch, to the president. And so the president has a lot of scope to set foreign policy and to set US China relations. But not complete, right? And so I think Ryan's and your comments about the NDAA in particular highlight the really important role that Congress has played. And often actually Congress has been willing to sort of persist in or be tougher on China at times when the executive branch might be looking for more flexibility. That's a trend that goes back to presidential administrations in the 1980s and the 1990s. It's a sort of time-honored division of labor in American China policy. And from where I sit at the state level, there is still a real concern about some of the potential threats that Chinese actions pose to things like critical infrastructure and the responsibility that state governments have for critical infrastructure, for certain parts of the cyber security and cyber defense mission as it relates to state government. There is concern about higher education policy issues. I mean, all of these are areas where states have authorities and an interest in sort of making sure that certain threats don't compromise their interests or the interests of the citizens of that state. And so both at the subnational level and the congressional level, I think you are seeing some sort of slightly different direction of movement. Again, that's not a new pattern in U.S. China relations, but where I think it becomes particularly interesting and important, especially as it relates to the NDAA, is whether or not the administration's focus in the NSS on a mutually beneficial economic relationship with China, how you square that with China's actions in the security realm, where it continues to press on US allies and partners. And if you just think about the last sort of couple of months, right, the Philippines, Japan, and Taiwan have all had, out of, if you think about the landscape of US allies and partners in Asia, all three have had significant tensions in the military realm with the PRC. And so there's also just a bit of a tension in American policy right now between some of the measures in the NDAA that really buttress allies in the face of the direct security challenges that they're encountering from the PRC, and this sort of overriding focus on a mutually beneficial economic relationship that is in the NSS. It's not to say that the US doesn't talk about allies and partners, but for example, North Korea as a regional security threat's nowhere in the NSS, which I think is a first for many NSSs. If you go back and look, I'd have to go back and look and see when the last time was that North Korea was not named, but it's been a while. And so, if you think about the allies and partners and broader regional stability and how you try to square that with this focus on the economic center of gravity in the US China relationship, there's a strategic tension there that I think the administration will have to reconcile, and will have to do that in combination with other actors like Congress in writing the NDAA, like subnational governments who have to worry about their own critical infrastructure and responsibilities for that. And so you're going to see, I think, some of these tensions evolve and bubble and change over the course of the rest of the administration.
Absolutely. That's a significant distinction. I'm so glad you pointed out. And also, this China's continued push against our allies and partners, that does not necessarily change. Actually, it doesn't change at all according to how our NSS has changed. One area that I have noticed from the NSS that has changed is the Taiwan language. You mentioned that North Korea was like unprecedentedly not mentioned in the document, but the Taiwan language in this NSS is unprecedented in its length. Although the position, as stated in the document, is that U.S. position has not changed. So, based on this interesting distinction or this interesting contrast, Sheena, I wonder what do you read are the changes, if any, from the Taiwan language from the NSS?
Oh gosh, this is a tough one. So first, I have no inside knowledge, and if Ryan does, he should jump in and just cut me off because I don't know what the debate in the interagency was over the drafting of this specific language. Usually this language gets sort of negotiated to a fine degree of precision, but I don't really know much about the interagency process that generated this document, and I don't know that we can assume that it was the same as previous national security staff processes that have produced previous versions of the document. Um, so that said, I think U.S. China relations is a domain, I think more than any other, and Taiwan in particular is a domain more than any other area of American foreign policy where precision of language is exquisitely important and frankly, like annoyingly to anybody, even very experienced people in other areas of American foreign policy. And so I think from a generalist standpoint, I would be a little bit cautious if I was talking to somebody about over interpreting the shift from, support, do not oppose, right? To what extent does the administration itself think it made a significant change there? I don't know. We'd have to have more information on the policy process. It does send a signal, and that signal may be bigger than some of the drafters realize, given how carefully negotiated every single word is and how much debate over interpretation is. I sometimes explain to my students that the Deputy Secretary of State had to at one point go account for particular translations of each word in a specific communique and explain which translation the United States government regarded as authoritative, right? That kind of wordsmithing and verbal precision is not really characteristic of this president in particular, right? He tends to speak extemporaneously. He tends to speak off the cuff. He's actually been quite disciplined on some of his language about strategic and sticking to strategic ambiguity in some cases more than others. But I guess I'm hesitant. Yes, there was a change. That change is going to be interpreted as a signal. My confidence interval is very wide on how intentional that signal was, and therefore how good of a predictor it will be of any future U.S. policy on Taiwan. I think the much bigger questions arise around what is going to happen in a one-on-one conversation or who, depending on the small group that's in the room, when President Trump goes to Beijing, which we think will happen sometime later this year. And I think those conversations are much more likely to be decisive than this minor wording shift that we're seeing in the NSS. But Ryan, I may be wrong. I may be not reading enough into the wording of the document. What do you think?
No, I would agree, Sheena, with everything you've laid out, and certainly I wouldn't pin American policy on Taiwan to the formulations of any particular document. To your point, but I think it's worth disambiguating between the three things, right? There's what's written in the national security strategy. There's what senior officials are saying is American policy. And then there's the record of American action on Taiwan, which all of these things have sent varying signals to varying audiences. And it's really difficult, I think, for any American administration to balance its legitimate interests with deterring Chinese aggression across the Taiwan Strait, along with what is partnership management and the traditional trials and tribulations of trying to get your partners to act in ways that are consistent with what you want your partners to do. I'll say just a couple of things here that might be helpful as folks think about what the cross-strait relationship might look like over the next couple of years. First of all, I think the tension between signaling some strategic commitment to Taiwan and trying to get Taiwan to do more with burden sharing mirrors many of the same dynamics that are found in almost any other U.S. partnership or alliance with any other state, right? It's hard power hawks who want stronger commitments to Taiwan. And at the same time, you have these folks who are urging a more transactional approach, who question why America should defend Taiwan when it refuses to pay for its own protection. I think that the insertion of this economic nationalist wing of the Trump administration, who resent Taiwan's simultaneous domination of the global semiconductor industry and inadequate defense spending, risks disturbing a kind of delicate equilibrium that has characterized American cross-strait policy for quite a long time. I think it's their view that Taiwan's stranglehold over chip production presents a dangerous vulnerability for the United States, which they believe Taipei has weaponized for its own strategic protection, that suggests U.S. commitments regarding Taiwan might be negotiable in a way that they've never been thought before. But I will say that the Trump administration's willingness to clarify that U.S. policy on Taiwan is unchanged, and some of the formulations in the NSS that articulate Taiwan's importance to the United States in the first island chain, I think are a very strong signal of where the administration is at. And I think that the fact is that regardless of what is said in any bilat or out loud by any American official, even the president, the fact is that peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait remains a core interest to the United States. There's no way around it. Taiwan is an indelible element of not just global security architecture, but the global economy. And that is, I think, the number one lens through which the Trump administration is viewing this problem. And it hasn't changed.
It definitely sends some mixed signals, I would say, as a watcher of this relationship and how different U.S. administrations have framed this issue, answered some of the questions, provided some clarity in some cases. I think this particular period is quite confusing, I think, for a lot of policy observers. And I suppose this will be also confusing for the Chinese. So in your impression, in your analysis, how are the Chinese thinking about this national security strategy? Are they cheering? Are they particularly happy? Are they lamenting some of the U.S. approaches? What's your impression on that, Ryan? Maybe we'll go to you first.
Sure. I wouldn't know what to think if I were sitting in Beijing. I think on the one hand, I think that Beijing will likely take some solace in the fact that the United States, in some ways, appears to be rescinding its claim to hegemony in Asia. If you subscribe to the view that the NSS or that the administration is interested in carving up some kind of sphere of influence, if it is true, which I don't know that this is a given, but if you read U.S. action out of the belief that the United States is walking back from some of its security commitments in Asia, then probably you would have reason to celebrate in Beijing. Probably China will seek to redouble its own influence in regional fora like ASEAN. The real question is in how coercive I think China can afford to act on its own of some of these, towards some U.S. partners in Asia, even as it raises the specter of a strident and imperial United States to rally new partners from the global periphery. On the other hand, I think in battlegrounds where the United States has signaled that it is willing to defend American interests to a hilt. For now, that's certainly the Western Hemisphere, but it extends, I think, to other theaters as well. Then probably, I think Beijing will be more effectively deterred. An unshackled America will be able to act more freely and defend its interests with more vigor from encroaching on its core interests. The hope, certainly, I think, in the Trump administration and the expectation is that the capture of Maduro, the bombing of Iran's nuclear facilities, signal the seriousness of American commitment to defend its core interests and will reverberate through the halls of Zhongnanhai. And that is probably something that is happening.
Yeah, keep them in the fog of war, in the unpredictability mode. Sheena, what's your observation? You have the last words. How do the Chinese view the NSS? Do they see it as an opportunity? An opportunity to do what?
Well, first, I think there's probably more than one reaction, as even among a relatively tight, set of views within the Chinese Communist Party leadership. I guess I would make a couple of different points. One, I think the goal of a mutually beneficial economic relationship again, as an overarching top line slogan sounds great. I think the immediate question that comes up when sort of talking to Chinese interlocutors or reading the press is, okay, then how do tariffs fit in that goal? That seems that strikes, again, reading Chinese sources and having some conversations, right? The means and the ends don't seem to match in Beijing's view. Second, there's this idea of, okay, does the focus on the Western Hemisphere, to the extent that that's a sort of spheres of influence way of viewing the world, it is still unclear what that means for the United States, which also commonly has described itself historically as a Pacific power, which has territory in Hawaii, in Alaska, in Guam, that is not very far from certain parts of Asia, and certainly in the Pacific, right? And has treaty ally commitments in the Pacific. So if America is a Pacific power, even if you have the Don Monroe Doctrine or this Western Hemispheric focus, what does that mean for Asia? I think still there's a lot of question about, in practice, what the implications will be for American foreign policy in Asia. Third, it seems like the administration is using maybe two metrics to think about how it evaluates allies and partners. One is investment in the United States, which I don't know that the Chinese are as focused on. The other is burden sharing and spending on defense. And to the extent that the United States is pushing allies and partners to spend a bigger percentage of GDP on defense, that is unlikely to be viewed positively by China, especially if you're talking about Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines. So that may actually be seen as redounding to China's very real detriment. And then fourth, this sort of sense that the United States has become inherently less predictable under President Trump as a very sort of what I've heard Chinese interlocutors characterize as a kind of strongman executive model within the U.S. system, right? To the extent that that's seen as inherently less predictable and potentially less stable, there's a set of trade-offs there for China that in China accrues some strategic narrative benefit that we've already seen deployed in their diplomatic response to Venezuela to be able to paint the United States as a destabilizing actor and China as the force that is upholding the post-1945 UN-led international order, China as the sort of source of or proponent of peace and stability among the great powers. So there's some narrative and discursive diplomatic benefits to China of that critique that it will seize the opportunity to make. But I think there's also some genuine worry that some of these actions really are destabilizing in ways that will not benefit Chinese interests, whether it's in Venezuela or Iran or in Ukraine or Europe. And so I think there's just a fair amount of uncertainty about their view of the U.S. policy process and the extent to which that will have costs versus benefits for China. So those are sort of four pieces of the reaction that I'm hearing that I think are still very much kind of settling out. The Chinese political system tends to take a while to arrive at a view of key events, or there tends to be a let's wait and see reaction to some U.S. policy statements. Yeah, there's obviously a foreign ministry response often quite quickly, but in the strategic sense, I think these are the four areas where they will be looking to kind of wait and see and evaluate U.S. policy. And those are the questions that I think I detect in some of the writing and conversation now.
Very insightful observation. Yeah, I think the Chinese have a lot of mixed feelings and also a lot of uncertainty as for, is this real? Even if it is, how is it going to transpire? So, well, we're coming to the end of our interview. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and insights with us today. I would also like to thank the National Committee staff members behind the scene who have made today's interview possible. We hope those who have tuned in today found the interview both interesting and informative. I certainly have learned a lot. Hope that you will join us for future National Committee programming. Thank you all again. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thanks very much for doing this.
Thank you.